So switching gears a bit from a more of a, sort of very product focus now to the people aspects of it. So as organizations face so much volatility, we thought this would be a really on-point presentation and panel. So for the presentation, I'm very fortunate to have Gaurav Gupta, and he's an affiliate with Kotter International and co-author of the best-selling book, Change: How Organizations Achieve Hard-to-Imagine Results in Uncertain and Volatile Times. Clearly something we all want to do. And then following this talk will be the panel, which has a few of our lab partners that we're also very fortunate to have joining us today. So we have Sandhya, who's the lead of the clinical genomics section at the Bioinformatics and Computational Biosciences branch in the Office of Cyberinfrastructure and Computational Biology at NIAID. Joining her is Jason Barnett, who's also with NIAID. He's the lead there in the medical science and computing, and he works very closely with Sandhya. And then finally, a long-term collaborator of ours is Dave O'Connor, who's head of the O'Connor Lab at the University of Wisconsin. So with the introductions out of the way, I will pass it on to Gaurav now. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Really happy to be here and talking to you. So since we're talking to a group here that I think deals with a lot of data and information, I thought maybe I'd just start with a question, which is, if you're to imagine all of the data and information that exists in the world today, and you were to guess how much of that has been created in the last 2 or 3 years, what do you think that percentage might be, right? So what percentage of data do you think is created in the last couple of years? And I'll give you a second to think about that. Now, I don't actually know the answer to this, but what I do know the answer to is a research study that was done actually probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. And at the time, that number was 90%. So at the time, the last 2 years, we had created 90% of all of the information that was available in sort of the space out there, right? And that to me is just it's incredible to think about that number, because what that essentially says is that in 2 years, we had created 9 times more information than the 10, 20,000 years of civilization before that. That may not be so surprising to those of you who deal with data and information on a daily basis, but for me it was. And what that sort of suggests is that the level of information we're having to deal with, the level of sort of data we need to process, understand, in order to make good decisions is going up. And that's one measure of uncertainty, right? Uncertainty has been, at least intuitively, has felt like it's been going up significantly, at least in the last 18 months. I think all of us have felt this in various ways in terms of how it hits our professional lives and how it hits our personal lives and our health. And if you look at the data, and this is now something from the IMF, and if you look at what uncertainty, this is an uncertainty index that they've created, but what that's been doing over the last 20 years, it's actually been trending up, right? So although there's this massive spike that we've all felt, and so intuitively it sort of feels like, yes, in the last 18 months, uncertainty has been high, the data suggests that's not anomalous, right? The data suggests that actually uncertainty has been going up for a little while now. And that's important because it's not just the uncertainty, which to me I sort of define as the perception that things might change in the future. But it's not just that perception. Change itself has also been coming at us faster. And this is just one way of looking at this. There are plenty of other sort of data sources you can use to look at the amount of change that we're facing. This one just looks at some products and how long it took those products to reach 50 million users. In case you're wondering, that last little symbol at the bottom, that's Pokemon Go, which was an extremely popular game a few years ago. And that reached 50 million users in 19 days, which is crazy. Now, obviously different when you're talking about software and a game than when you're talking about telephone and hardware, but you see the same thing play out in various different ways, right? You see this in terms of the number of years that companies spend on the S&P 500. It used to be about 40, 45 years in the 60s, and now it's about 20, 25 years. If you look at the number of sort of patents filed internationally, that's gone up exponentially since the 90s. And so change is coming at us faster. And what that means is it sort of results in this in this problem and this opportunity. And what this graph represents is, the external environment around organizations, around companies, around teams is changing at a pace that is greater than the ability of most organizations and teams to change. And that's creating this massive gap between what we need in terms of our ability to change and what we're capable of achieving as organizations and teams. And so that sort of, is essentially the reason we wrote the book that we did, is essentially the reason we did the research that we did, is because we need to find better ways to essentially bend that bottom curve up, right? Find ways to increase our ability to respond to change, both sort of reactively, but also proactively, so that we can start to close that gap between the external pace and the internal one. So if I now sort of look at the research and say, what can we learn about human biology? What can we learn about modern organizations? What can we learn about the process of leading change? And what can that tell us about how we can better help organizations and teams change? And we start with the human side, right? We start with sort of the individual. And for anybody who's ever tried to change any kind of a habit or help anybody change a habit, this probably feels somewhat familiar, right? This idea that there's a status quo bias, there's a resistance to change, and in general, it's hard to get people to change. Now, this is only part of the story, though, because if you look at even something like human sort of civilization history, what you see is there are moments where we embrace change, right? There are moments where we run towards change. We are a curious species. We are, we are a species that looks for novelty, that looks for new things. New things are exciting. And so in our personal lives and in our professional lives, not all change is viewed as something that we fear. Not all change is things that we resist. Some change we actually embrace, and some change we actually run towards. And so the question that poses is what's the difference, right? Why are some things change that we resist, and why are some things change that we embrace? And how can we start to understand that? And then what can that understanding tell us about how we can better engage with people as we're trying to drive any sort of change in organizations or teams? Excuse me. And so we started to look at some of the brain science behind this and some of the behavioral science, and that led us to this sort of two-channel construct, right? And the idea here is hardwired into us is a survive channel, and that survive channel is essentially looking for threats in our environment. And so if you go back 20,000 years, this was primarily physical threats, right? The sort of the proverbial predator in the bush. Of course, that same hardwiring has now been co-opted to function not just for physical threats, but essentially any kind of threat to our well-being. So that could be threats to our emotions, that could be threats to our status, that could be obviously physical threats as well. And what happens when we see one of those threats is it's an autonomous system in the body. We've got chemicals that are released, things like adrenaline, and that causes us to focus really hard on eliminating the threat in front of us. So our energy spikes. We're able to, do things like work for 20 hours straight on the problem and find ways to resolve this problem. And as long as things are functioning relatively well, this works really well, right? This is the reason we're able to deal with all sorts of problems in an effective way. And this is what you might typically think of as your fight or flight response. Now, in parallel to this system, we've also got a thrive activating system. And this system is triggered by opportunities. So this is the part of our biology that gets us to run towards new things, that's sort of sparked by curiosity. And what this leads to is, there's again chemicals being released in the body, and it leads to a broadening of perspective, increase in energy, although not quite as much as on the survive side. It leads to emotions like passion and excitement, and the sorts of behaviors it drives are innovation and collaboration. So the exact sorts of things that in a highly changing world are very useful, and in a world where collaboration is at such a high premium, the more we can activate that thrive side of our nature, the more effective we're going to be. And then the other thing I want to talk about quickly, just in terms of the research, is because we operate within the context of an organization, we do also need to understand how that places limitations or constraints on our ability to change. And so if you think about organizations for a second, and I'll ask you to imagine for a moment that you're, say, a cobbler. So on that sort of left-hand side of this picture, you're a cobbler in the 1700s, right? And if you think about what your business looks like, you do everything. You procure the materials, you stitch the shoes, you fit your patrons, you do all your marketing, you do all your accounting, you do all of it. And if you're highly successful, you might have, a couple of apprentices, but they're essentially doing all of the same functions as well and learning from you. If you now fast forward through the industrial age and think about what a cobbler of today looks like, that might be a company like Nike, right? And it's got manufacturing facilities globally, highly specialized functions, so not just accounting and finance and that sort of thing, but even within the production, there's people who are specialized in operating the machinery that treats the leather, and those who are operating machinery that stitches the leather. And so there's a very high degree of specialization. There's a much higher degree of complexity. There's a much higher need to manage resources across geographic disparity, across obviously that functional disparity. And so the way we dealt with this almost infinite increase in complexity was through what many of us would find quite familiar now, right? It's all of the management systems of today. It's reporting structures, it's job descriptions, it's metrics, it's all of the tools that we have developed over the last 150 years or so that create these formal systems within organizations. And that works really well in a world that's not quite moving at the pace that it is today, and in a world that doesn't quite need the level of collaboration that we need today. Because what that organization effectively did is it optimized for control, it optimized for reliability, consistency, right? The goal was I made a pair of shoes, whether it was in Vietnam or in Peru, they were exactly the same, right? I used the same process, I used the same technology. It was all about driving that consistency and reliability of performance. And you had a few people at the top of the organization who were responsible for looking out for those threats and opportunities that we talked about earlier. They were setting strategy, they were setting direction. They were the ones who would make all of the meaningful decisions within the organization. And the challenge with that model today is, as things have sped up, as the pace of change has gone up, as the amount of information we need to deal with has gone up, having a few people making those decisions is just not effective, right? And we now need more people all across the organization, collaborating more with each other, being able to make decisions together, so having access to more data and information in a meaningful way, and actually being able to show more leadership throughout the organization, not just at the sort of top of the house, right? And so the question becomes, how do we shift our organizations to be able to do that while maintaining all of the positive aspects of the sort of organizational form, which is the reliability and the consistency. And that leads us to the third stream of research, which is all around leading change. And I won't spend too much time on this, except to say there's four principles that we think have an oversized role to play in being able to overcome some of those limitations. And the first is this idea of select few and diverse many. And that's to say, there are certain things that, yes, we want specialized teams, we want a small group of people to be directed at, but then there are others for which we want a broad group of diverse opinions, diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, diverse positions in the hierarchy of the organization to tackle. And typically we sort of default to the select few, and in organizations that are able to sort of balance both that reliability and consistency with agility and innovation, they're able to tap into this diverse many as well. Similarly, have to and want to. The idea is there are certain parts of what we do that are, our job description, they're the things we have to do. But the more we can ignite passion for what people want to do, the more we can get people to work on projects, initiatives, ideas that they're really passionate about, the sort of the greater progress we're going to make, the higher productivity we're going to have, and the more innovation we're going to see. Head and heart is essentially, I think it really plays out when it comes to communication, particularly communicating around ideas. And the principle is pretty simple. We need intellectually compelling messages. We also need emotionally compelling messages. And so when we're trying to get people to come on board with an idea, the more we can speak to both the head and the heart, the more effective we're going to be. And then finally, management and leadership, which we've talked a little bit about, which is essentially the idea of balancing that reliability and consistency, but with leadership behaviors that are all directed at things like inspiration, at vision setting, at motivation, because that provides the agility and adaptability within the organization. So what I wanted to spend sort of quick 5 minutes on then is what are some tactics to do this, right? And so the first one is to acknowledge the threats in the environment and then reframe them as opportunities, because the research clearly shows burning platforms, threats, crises, they get us to move, they get us to take action, but it is very difficult to sustain change and sustain action if all we have is a burning platform, right? So yes, we've got to acknowledge the threats, but we've also got to find the opportunities in the work that we're doing so that we can inspire more longer-term action from people. The second one is around celebrating wins and demonstrating progress. And one of the things we've seen often is people launch large-scale change efforts with the expectation that all the effort builds up over time, and then you see this big sort of result at the end. And the challenge with that is people lose steam. And so you get halfway through and people have lost steam. They don't see the success from it. They're not sure it's going to work, and you start to lose momentum. And so being able to celebrate, create wins, demonstrate progress in small and big ways along the way is essential to, again, being able to maintain that momentum and energy as people move through what could be a difficult change. The third tactic is around this idea of broadening beyond the usual suspects. So how do you engage more people? How do you delegate some control? And there's various reasons to do this. One of which, and probably in many ways the most important one, is what I call the IKEA effect, which is if you've ever built any furniture from IKEA or furniture in other ways, you tend to value things you've invested time and effort in, right? So when you build that piece of IKEA furniture, you tend to value it more than you would had you just bought it pre-made. And so the more you can get people involved early, the more they can have a say in it, the more they can contribute, they can collaborate, they can be part of it, the more likely they are to not just support the idea, but to actively engage with it. And so the third sort of tactic is delegating control as much as you can, creating more opportunities for people to have a say, have a voice, be involved. And that doesn't have to be in large ways. It can be in pretty small ways. It can be providing input. It can be providing feedback. It doesn't necessarily have to be making large decisions. And then the final tactic I wanted to touch on is this idea of reducing the noise. And what I mean by that is, when we talked about those threats and opportunities, and I said, the threats are not just physical threats anymore, they come in various forms. And in an organizational setting, those threats actually come constantly, right? There's a sort of 3 a.m. email that we get that sort of sparks a bit of a moment of a threat in our mind. There's the metrics that we review that, there's always something that doesn't quite look right. There's the reports that we have to complete. There are various different things that happen during the course of a day that can sort of feel to us as a threat and can have the same physiological response as a physical threat. And so the more we can find ways to reduce that noise and all of that sort of threat-inducing triggers, the more people can create space to focus on the sort of the thrive side, right? Can focus on activating opportunity. And so what that means is looking for opportunities to remove things that aren't adding value anymore. What are the marginal reports that used to be valuable but aren't anymore? What are the metrics that we used to track for a reason but we don't need anymore? What's the data that, yes, it would be great to have and review, but actually it's only in the margins? And and how do we start to reduce the amount of noise in the organization so that we can actually start to amplify the opportunities and we can start to activate more Thrive. So those are sort of the 4 tactics: acknowledge the threat, reframe as an opportunity, celebrate wins and progress along the way, delegate control as much as possible, involve people, engage them early, and then finally reduce the noise, because all of this contributes to mitigating that survive response and helping to activate that more collaboration, innovation, producing Thrive response. So I'll stop with that, and we can jump to the panel and take questions as we'd like. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gaurav. Appreciate it. I think I still suffer with a little IKEA PTSD from over the years, but I appreciate the concept that the buy-in that comes with it. And one of the things that resonated me with the book was this, not the either or that I think, in the binary sense of, fight or flight, survive or thrive, but the concept of balancing the two to have successful change, a successful organization. So that in particular resonated with me. I enjoyed the book. So thank you. So as we shift sort of from the best practices, right? But now we're going to talk about folks who've actually gone through this. So thank you to my panelists, and I'll in a virtual dynamic, I'll do my best to facilitate the conversation. So I think maybe first, Sandhya, if you can talk about what were some of the major change initiatives that you and your organization had to go through to set the stage for the discussion.
So I will say that the survive and thrive, for me, I think the most attractive part of that slide was the fact that they actually feed into one another, that they're not closed circles. I think that as you survive, you realize how you can also thrive, but make sure that you first survive, right? So those are kind of key things. So in our own organization, I think one of the first times that we really encountered change was when we had to capture clinical genomics data. So what I mean by that is both integrating clinical and genomics data. And, we didn't have really a lot of digitization of a lot of these data sources. And even the data was in multiple sources. So I think that understanding that you can bite off little pieces at a time, celebrate those small wins, and then make sure that you use all of those chunks then to build the larger, right? I think what I found with the development teams, at least, is that, they want to make sure that every piece that you develop is built on. That is their biggest achievement. In a sense, that's what they look, that's how they measure wins, is, are you going to use what you built later? So what that means, of course, is then you have your select set of requirements, but then you also have your vision for the requirements. You understand what your IT infrastructure is, what it's capable of, what are the new things that are available, and then bring to bear in a way that is sort of prioritized so that you're not constantly pulling apart and throwing apart, but you're actually building on things. And that helped a lot for us with the whole system. And definitely the key for collaboration, we've found that that's one of the best supporting, the best part of this whole thing is the collaborative kind of framework that you need. And I think that, Gaurav mentioned uncertainty. I think that COVID, probably as he showed, was one of the most important things that made you realize how uncertain the world can become but then really it was the opportunity for us. So, when first our investigators told us, well, you need to be able to collect all of these data from these multiple clinical sites and bring them into a digitized version, we said, but what we did was, the first thing was survive, which is, okay, whatever system we have in-house, just use it. But then we found that system couldn't sustain longitudinal data. So then we said, well, look around to see frantically, but keeping in mind what you already know exists in your infrastructure, so that you can then, make sure that that's whatever you choose will be able to be, sustainable, right? And so for us, actually, the needs it was really a very important impetus for us to bring on, for example, LabKey, right? But when we brought it on, I think the importance also is in evaluating the vendor, right? Because you want to make sure that you choose a vendor that's going to be responsive to your needs. So, pose your requirements, and when you get your response back, evaluate it for how responsive you think they may be helping you in develop the system. So, yeah, I think that seizing the need, looking around and looking at that external milieu, not just for, where is the gap, but what is it that, what are possibilities that you can bring in. I think that those were very key things in that we've done. So,
thank you. I think those are all examples of some of the suggestions, recommendations, best practices, and then how you did them in practice, right? How you got practically in a crisis, had to put them into action. So thank you. Yeah, Dave, how about yourself? I know there were a couple of over the years that we've got to learn about major change initiatives that you've had to be a part of. Maybe you can describe them and talk about how your team worked through them.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So for those who don't know me, I'm Dave O'Connor. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I run a research group that studies infectious diseases, and we've had several big changes in the time that we've been working with LabKey, which has been for more than a decade. One came in 2016 when there was the Zika virus epidemic in South America, and we made the decision to make data available in real time. Now there's a push towards making more information more available publicly more quickly. You've seen this a lot in the preprints, bioRxiv and medRxiv in COVID. This follows the lead of physics and the hard sciences, which have been doing this for far, far longer, but this was not common at all in biology. And it has connections with this idea that science needs to be reproducible, which had been what we had been thinking LabKey was best at previously. But then once we had that in mind, we were able to basically just change a permission and take our internal data that we were collecting very quickly and make it available to everyone in the world without any constraints on it. And this was really great because it allowed people to build on our knowledge, and we were out pretty quickly in front of the field in terms of developing animal models for Zika. We replicated this again in the early days of animal model development for COVID, but this did put new pressures on people. And I think it's important to be honest and say that, this sort of change, even though it worked well on the balance, wasn't at all seamless. Just in the last month, one of our data sets was called Almost Criminal, that we published a preprint showing that viral loads with the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 were as high in the noses of people who were vaccinated as people who weren't. And Vincent Racaniello, who hosts a popular podcast, basically said it was irresponsible to put that out there in a preprint. I happen to think that transparency and making the data available allows people to make their own conclusions and draw their own interpretations. But that was one big change that really had to change the culture of the lab. And then the second one also was COVID. We had a bit of a head start on this because we had a remote, we started dabbling with remote work when I lived in Australia from 2018 to 2019. And so my lab had to deal with me not being around. We also had a remote employee who works for us from Chicago, and now we're a true hybrid lab, and we're planning on staying this way. This creates communication challenges. This gets to what was discussed with reducing the noise. At first, we thought that more noise was better, that more communication was an undeniable good, but in fact, we realized that that was a mistake, and that we took lessons from some of the methodologies that the folks at Basecamp and Cal Newport has advocated in his World Without Email book, where we need to actually turn down the volume of communication so that people have concentrated time to get things done. So now our graduate students work on 6-week cycles, and we try to empower problem solving, flexibility, outcome-based accountability. And we actually turn down almost to zero the volume of our Slack, which had been a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week freewheeling conversation, but it meant that people were always either totally engrossed in it or had a fear of missing out. So we got rid of that. We still use it for some things, like we're taking group notes on this right now, as there's multiple people from our group here. But I think that LabKey has been just really essential in allowing us to put our data places, no matter when people are collecting it, no matter when they're analyzing it. And it allows us to have trust in the systems that the data is being collected and analyzed, without feeling the need to either be performative about how much we're working, or feel like people are slacking off if they're not working all the time.
Thanks, Dave. So when you first, I got periphery, but when you first said, okay, let's change our methodology, let's change our philosophy on data sharing, clearly you must have had a lot of barriers. It wasn't seamless. So what were some of the things some of the techniques you used to get people to think about it, maybe not as a threat, as an opportunity to think about it differently, to open up to it?
Well, I think transparency is key. Running a research lab does sort of allow me to be a tyrant, and be in control of how things are being done. And I'm not saying that you want to use that power indiscriminately, but sometimes you do have to use it. So in the book that was described, they talked about, some people are just harder to pull along, and certainly there are people in our group who are more resistant to change than others. And trying to basically first show how the change could be beneficial. And then if there's still resistance, basically just overriding it and saying that sometimes for the greater good, you have to just make decisions, and you have to try them out with the expectation that it might completely fail. You give it enough time to see if it is a resistance to change, or if it's the idea itself that was broken. So for example, at the beginning of the year, as part of our remote work conversion, we switched from having lab meetings where people gave an oral presentation of their work to a written document where people read it quietly for 20 or 30 minutes and then we discuss. And we gave it, I said at the outset, we'd give it 3 to 6 months. We've given it 3 to 6 months. It still seems to be working. So we're doing it. So, introduce change with the idea that you can always go backwards and revert it if it's not working. But make sure that you give it enough time that people's initial discontent isn't just the fact that it's change, and it's really the thing that they don't like, not just the change to the thing they don't like.
Thank you, Dave. Jason, when we spoke with myself, with you and Sandhya, you talked about those early successes, and it was important. One of the things I remember you both said, it was important for building trust and confidence. Maybe you could talk a bit about how you communicated those early successes internally to build some momentum.
I want to follow what Sandhya was saying about we had this crisis that we responded to with LabKey, and we had kind of a top-down approach to all of this data that's being collected by our research consortium needs to go in one place, and it needs to be harmonized and standardized so everyone in the consortium can consult their samples and clinical data together. And so we built that tool, but that is sort of the technology element of it. And to support that, we used LabKey's wiki and file management structure to allow us to post tutorials and training guides. We are active participants, even though we are not our IT team, which consists of software developers and subject matter experts in data analysis. They may not have been working directly with the data the way our clinicians and the research consortium was, but they actively participated in all of those research meetings. So every Friday, we have a meeting across the NIAID Research Consortium where folks present things that they're publishing. But it's one key part of it is all of the data is being hosted in LabKey. So it's sort of reinforcing that idea of there is a value to having all this data in one shared location. It also, but by our development team being in the meeting, we're able to hear problems and respond to them and engage with them. So I think Gaurav mentioned delegating control, and there's certain things we don't turn LabKey configuration loose to a large number of people. We of course sequester that, but we there are certain things that our development team will not do, and that is, make certain consensus decisions about how should this longitudinal clinical data be presented, or can we come to some consensus about what is the accepted value unit to be used for certain measurement. And those are real decisions that we have built a focus group for, and that focus group is in charge of coming to these consensus decisions, and then our development team can then respond with the transformations that might be necessary to implement that. But I would say that engagement has been very important, as well as delegating authority over ownership of the data to the folks using the system.
Thanks, Jason. Then here you also mentioned that the value, continuing to show the benefit, the value of what we're trying to drive, having the data all in one place, that there's a value to the constituents. Gaurav, as you got to hear from the three panelists, brief introductions, what's resonating for you from the research that you've done, and from the teachings and from the book? What's hitting home?
One of the things I wanted to sort of jump back to is this sort of, when we think about survive, thrive, and the motivation for change. And Sandhya, you talked about, you've got to survive first before you thrive, and sort of they are interlinked. And then this idea of how do you get the resistors over change, and do you just use some authority to push through, or do you actually have to coax everyone? And I think the point I wanted to make is there are certain types of change for which activating survive is the right way to motivate that change, right? The burning crisis is the correct way to motivate change in certain situations. Situations where, for example, the solution is to do the same thing for longer, or the same thing harder, or the same thing, right, where you don't need creativity, essentially. I think maybe that's the best way to do it. So it's a change where you don't need creative, innovative solutions. You just need people to do something a little bit differently. The survive activation works just fine. But it's when you're talking about situations where you need innovation, where you need creativity, you need people to collaborate in a different way, you need everybody to be presenting new ideas. That's when the survive activating change stops working, because the research is sort of pretty clear on this, that when the survive channel is highly activated or overactivated, innovation ceases, right? You're focusing very narrowly, and all innovation and collaboration ceases. And so that's just one distinction maybe to draw, is that if you think about the kind of change you're trying to drive, and what behaviors you want to see from the change you're driving, that might prompt you to go, actually, you know what, I can just use not a threat, that's the wrong way to say it, but an expression of what the threat is and why we need to change. And then the need for change can be that message that way. But if what you need is more creativity and innovation, then you may need to think about how you message it in a more forward-looking, opportunity-focused manner.
Thanks, Gaurav. So when you think about the role that that an external partner, in this case it was LabKey, plays in the equation, so what did you see that worked? What were some of the best practices that you learned from, and even that we learned from, in terms of being a partner and supporting the change?
It is really listening. And I mean this in a way that when we communicated our requirements, you actually hear them first, but then you convert them internally into aspects that, so, one way to hear is to say, okay, you want me to do this, okay, I will do it, right? But the other way is to take that, internalize it, and look for opportunities and look for things that already exist maybe within your within the current LabKey, and then tweak it or make it so that it'll fit, so that the users of our requirements would kind of fit in that framework, or make it in a way that that'll fit in the framework, so that then you can, so then we feel like you're hearing us, you're listening to us, not just hearing us, but then we also know that it's going to be a sustainable product. So it's not some sort of one-off that you can just create for us, that it just sort of hangs somewhere, and it's not part of this bigger milieu and this bigger, community used infrastructure. And I think that's really key, right? So the word community, at least for me, is really important. I think the fact that you hear everybody, not only us, but other community users is important, because sometimes I think users can get stuck in a way of thinking that, okay, this is how I want to do it. But actually, when you bring to us other ways of how people do things, and then we say, oh, maybe that's what we should be doing. Maybe with a little tweaking in our workflows, we can actually do a better job, doing it that way. So I think that for us is very key, is not giving us a pat answer, but but still being responsive and never discrediting any request. You answer it fully to the best way you can, and if it's still necessary, then okay, then let's continue thinking about it. So that's important in my view.
Yeah, I guess I'd say it's the mutual listening. It's the us being willing to listen to what your true needs are, not just necessarily the state of requirements, but then the organization's willingness to say, maybe there is another way, maybe there is a different solution, maybe there are things we can learn from other organizations. So I kind of think it's the two-way listening that has to happen for us to succeed together.
Right. And the us, right? Because in a sense, what we are doing is communicating what the users are telling us. So there should always be an us rather than a you or a they or a we. And that's, I think, what helps is that wholesome way to look at things, holistic way to look at requirements and technologies.
And I know for LabCube, when we have the opportunity to also hear directly from the end users, the end researchers, the end scientists, the end users, it does help, because sometimes there is something that can get lost in translation, and that direct conversation can help. So I think it supplements the engagements and really helps. So I think, for all to hear, the more we can get to that end user or some of those communications, it really does help us be a better partner. Dave, so what other things, what other approaches have you found that have been successful for somebody who's been, I'll call you a change agent for several years at different engagements? So what are other things that you'd recommend to the audience?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm in the best position to be giving out, recommendations, because everyone's circumstances are so different. I can say that at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I'm located, we're a very grad student heavy and technician heavy lab environment. So, my lab is kind of like a truck stop on the highway of their lives. And that means that we have new people coming in all the time. They stay for a couple of years. Turnover is a given. We celebrate it because typically people come in for a year or two after they graduate, work in the lab, and then go to med school or go to grad school, or they're in the lab as PhD students and they get a PhD and then they go off and flourish in other parts of their career. But that means that, what my lab is and is capable of being is a little different than it would be in a place where you have a workforce. I'm very, very lucky to have people who have been with me for more than 15 years. But that's not at all given, and it's not the same as a place that has ability to promote extensively from within and have a really stable workforce. Because we have such high turnover, that does create unique circumstances that I think LabKey helps us with. So we've had a LabKey powered experiment notebook that we've used in our lab for more than a decade. This helps prevent data rot. So if someone does something and it's trapped in their hard drive or in their physical notebook, then we would have an impossible time trying to find it after they're no longer in the lab. It also means we have a consistently new workforce where we need to make sure that whatever tools people are going to use need to be easy and simple and straightforward. And that has to be a primary consideration, even above functionality. In terms of like what the tool can do. And, for us, these are just the sorts of considerations that are bespoke to our circumstances that wouldn't apply to everyone. But I think the notion of, avoiding data rot and making sure that things are easy to use is probably pretty generalizable.
Yeah, and as Sandhya mentioned too, that sustainability, or as Gaurav talked about this, a lot of times these are not short-term engagements, right? Whether it's short-term from a software perspective, or short-term, they're not. So you have to think through that sustainability component, a continuity component. Thank you, Sandhya. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Dave. Gaurav, any kind of parting comments before we shift to the next topic?
That's always a high bar, parting comment. No, I mean, I suppose just since this is the audience we're talking to, this idea of uncertainty increasing and the amount of information that we need to process increasing. I mean, we've looked at this in multiple different ways, and we don't see any signs that this is going to be any different, right? And so whatever we can do to find better ways to use that information, and Dave, a lot of what you're talking about in terms of open source and collaboration and I think it's just not really adding a whole lot other than to say it's just fantastic to hear some of what's happening, because that access to information for more people to be able to make better decisions is, I think, going to be critical to success in the next few years.